Usually when we talk about a diagnostic tool, say in medicine,
Hmm.
there is this expectation of mechanical precision.
Right.
Like you shatter your collarbone, you go get an x-ray, and that jagged white line just shows up right there on the film.
Clear as day.
Exactly. And the radiologist just taps the screen and says, there is the fracture. It is a completely binary reality. I mean, it's broken or it's not broken.
Mm.
And we find a lot of comfort in that level of visibility.
Oh, absolutely. It's definitive.
Right. But when you step into the world of economic theory, when you try to actually diagnose how the global engine produces wealth, that x-ray machine suddenly becomes remarkably unreliable.
Unreliable is putting it mildly.
Yeah. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape of how the world makes its money, and it is notoriously murky. I mean, you look at a corporate ledger, you see a line item labeled profit, but what are you actually looking at?
Right.
What is the real anatomy of that number, and where did it, physically speaking, originate?
It is basically the definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, the numbers on the page, they appear clean, right? They look mathematically sound, yet the underlying anatomical structure they represent is entirely obscured by the accounting itself.
Which is exactly why you and I are opening up the laboratory today.
Mm.
We are looking at an attempt to build the ultimate economic x-ray machine.
Yes, we are.
Specifically, we're diving into a monumental piece of intellectual history today. This is Volume 33 of the Marx and Engels collected works, or the MECW.
It's a massive, massive volume.
It really is. And just to be absolutely clear for you listening, as you join us on this journey today, our goal here is not to debate 20th century geopolitics.
Definitely not.
Right. Or, to argue whether the system is inherently good or evil.
Mm-hmm.
We are here strictly to reverse engineer the math.
Exactly. We're looking at the blueprint.
Yes, the blueprint of a revolutionary theory. We're unpacking the intricate mechanics of capitalism as they were mapped out by Karl Marx between 1861 and 1863.
Right, and we're specifically zooming in on notebooks XV to XX.
Exactly. So we are here to analyze the structure, not to tell you whether or not you should build a house.
And that framework is so essential because this specific period, 1861 to 1863, it really represents the second rough draft of what would eventually become Marx's magnum opus, Capital.
Oh, wow. Second rough draft.
Yeah. We are analyzing a staggering 1,472-page manuscript.
Wait. 1,400 pages.
Yes. Spread across 23 notebooks, broadly titled A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy.
Over 1,400 pages written by hand in just 2 years. I mean, that is just incredible output.
It's staggering. And, it wasn't just abstract philosophy he was writing down.
Right.
He was wrestling with a very specific structural contradiction that had completely paralyzed the economic giants who came before him.
People like Adam Smith.
Exactly. Adam Smith, David Ricardo, they basically built the foundation of classical political economy, but they slammed into a brick wall that Marx called the law of equivalence.
Okay. The law of equivalence. Let's actually unpack that for our listener because that seems like the core of the whole thing.
It really is. The law of equivalence is the philosophical and, honestly, the mathematical bedrock of how a free market is supposed to function.
Supposed to, right?
Classical economists posited that in a properly functioning, mature capitalist market, commodities are traded fairly for their equal value.
So it's an even trade.
Exactly. And value, in this classical sense, was determined by the socially necessary labor time required to produce a commodity.
Okay, so if I spend time making something, the value's based on that time.
Basically, yeah. So if a weaver brings a coat to the market and that coat took 10 hours of average social labor to produce, they should exchange it for another commodity, say a specific weight of iron.
Right.
Or, the monetary equivalent of that iron that also required 10 hours of average social labor to produce.
Equal for equal. I mean, it makes sense. A fair day's wage for a fair day's work.
Exactly. The fundamental premise is that nobody is being systematically defrauded at the point of exchange.
Right. No one is getting scammed. I give you 10 units of value, I receive 10 units of value back.
Perfectly balanced.
But if we accept that premise, and I know this is the massive roadblock that kicks off the entire manuscript in Volume 33, if every single transaction is a mathematically fair trade of equivalence, how does anyone ever generate a profit?
That is the paradox. That is exactly it.
Right.
If capitalism operates strictly on the law of equivalence, where does surplus value even enter the equation?
Right, because if everything is equal, it should just be flat.
Precisely. Imagine a factory owner. They go to the market and they buy raw cotton at its exact fair value.
Okay.
They buy weaving machinery at its exact fair value. They buy human labor at its exact fair value.
Everything is completely by the book.
Yes. They combine these elements, they produce a finished shirt, and they sell that shirt on the market at its exact fair value.
Right.
If every input was purchased at a fair equivalent and the output was sold as a fair equivalent, the ledger should inherently net out to zero.
It has to, mathematically. But the ledger doesn't neg out to zero. We know this empirically. I mean, industrialists accumulate massive compounding wealth. The surplus is undeniably there.
It is. And the early socialists who predated Marx, they saw this surplus and essentially concluded that the law of equivalence must be a lie.
Okay, so they thought the whole system was just a cheat.
Basically, they argued that profit was merely theft. In their view, the capitalist was simply breaking the rules of the market.
Like they were shortchanging people.
Yeah, either by aggressively underpaying workers below the actual value of their labor or by swindling consumers by overcharging for the finished goods.
Right. So they viewed profit as like a glitch in the matrix or just a moral failing of the individual capitalist being greedy.
Exactly.
But if I'm reading Marx's notebooks correctly here, he refuses to take that easy out.
He absolutely refuses.
Yeah, he realizes that you cannot write a comprehensive theory of capitalism by assuming the system is just a series of individual swindles. You have to assume the system works flawlessly.
Right. You have to assume the rules are being followed.
You have to assume the capitalist pays the absolute fair market value for the raw materials, for the machinery, and for the labor, and sells the product for a perfectly fair price. And they still end up with a surplus. He kind of forces himself to solve the math problem on hard mode.
He does. He puts himself in the toughest possible theoretical position. And to solve it without violating the law of equivalence, Marx has to identify a very specific, unique commodity on the market.
Okay, what is this magic commodity?
Well, the capitalist must find a commodity that they can purchase at its fair, objective value, but which possesses a use value that is fundamentally different from literally anything else in existence.
A unique use value.
Yes. He identifies this commodity as labor capacity, which, he later refines into the term labor power.
Okay, let's unpack this for our listener, because understanding the distinction between labor and labor capacity is really the skeleton key to this entire 1,400-page manuscript.
It is the key to everything.
If we look at how classical economists viewed workers, they treated human labor almost like purchasing a fixed asset.
Right.
Think of it in modern tech terms. I think this helps. The earlier economists thought the capitalist was buying a finite software license.
Okay, I like that.
You pay $100, you get $100 worth of computing utility, and the transaction is closed.
Right, a static transfer of value. The worker brings a predetermined amount of value to the factory, hands it over, and is just compensated for it.
But Marx realizes they aren't buying a static software license. They are hiring the software engineer.
Yes.
They are purchasing the capacity to write entirely new algorithms. I mean, it's like the difference between buying a AA battery and buying a hand-cranked generator.
That is a perfect analogy.
Right. The economists thought they were buying batteries with a fixed amount of energy. But Marx realizes, no, they are renting the generator.
They are renting the capacity to generate more.
Right. The capitalist pays the fair market value for that engineer's time, meaning they pay a wage that is sufficient to cover the engineer's rent, their groceries, and basic survival so they can return to the keyboard the next day.
Right, the cost of keeping the crank turning, to use your analogy?
Exactly. But the unique use value of that engineer, of that labor capacity, is that they can write code that generates exponential value far beyond the cost of their own survival.
The software engineer analogy works beautifully here. Labor capacity is the singular commodity whose actual consumption during the working day creates new exchange value.
Creates new value out of nothing.
Exactly. Let's look at the mathematical mechanics Marx lays out.
Let's do it.
The capitalist purchases a day's worth of labor capacity at its true, fair value, the cost of the worker's subsistence.
Right.
Let's say in an 1860s textile mill, it takes a worker exactly 4 hours of labor to produce enough value to equal their daily wages.
Okay, 4 hours to cover their food, shelter, and clothing.
Yes. But the capitalist didn't buy 4 hours of labor.
They bought a full day's capacity.
Precisely the distinction Marx makes. The worker doesn't get to go home after 4 hours. The contract stipulates a 12-hour working day.
Oh, right.
So the worker continues to spin cotton for another 8 hours.
Wow.
That additional 8 hours of labor is unpaid, but but not in a way that violates the market exchange.
Because they agreed to sell their daily capacity.
Exactly. The capitalist bought the day's capacity fairly. The worker is simply forced to utilize that capacity well past the point of their own reproduction. Those extra 8 hours materialize as surplus value.
So it's totally legal, totally fair, according to the rules of the market.
Yes. And the brilliance of Marx's breakthrough in these notebooks is that the law of equivalence remains entirely intact. The capitalist paid the fair market price.
It just so happens that human labor capacity is literally the only commodity in the universe that generates more value in its consumption than it costs in its acquisition. You know, the implications of that shift, the very tectonic plates of how we view workplace. I mean, if we accept Marx's premise here, the factory floor, the corporate office, the modern fulfillment center, these are no longer neutral sites of equal exchange, where time is neatly swapped for currency.
Not at all.
They become the exclusive sites of value genesis. It is the only place in the economic model where something is generated from nothing, where surplus is actively birthed through human exertion. And it's completely hidden behind the veneer of a fair transaction.
It's a completely hidden process. And that hidden nature introduces the next massive roadblock Marx tackles in Volume 33.
Okay, where does he go next?
This brings us to the core of Notebook 16, specifically the third chapter, which is on capital and profit.
Oh, okay.
If surplus value is generated exclusively by the worker sweating on the factory floor, why is that reality completely invisible to the capitalist?
Right. Why don't they see it?
Exactly. Why does the industrialist look at their ledger and simply see a generalized category called profit?
This is where the X-ray machine we talked about gets a highly distorting filter placed over it.
It really does.
Marx uses a phrase in the text that initially reads like a paradox. He says, profit always expresses surplus value too small.
Yes, a very famous line.
Let's break down the actual math he uses to prove this, because this isn't just some accounting trick. It's really the central illusion of the whole capitalist system.
Right. To understand the illusion, we really have to look at the capitalist's ledger.
Okay, let's open the books.
The capitalist basically divides their investment into two categories. First, they lay out money for the building, the steam engines, and the raw cotton.
The physical stuff.
Yes. Marx categorizes this as constant capital. He often denotes it as the letter C in his equations.
Constant capital C? Got it.
He calls it constant because these items do not create new value. They merely transfer their existing stored value into the finished shirt as they are consumed or worn down.
Right. A steam engine doesn't magically create value out of thin air. If it costs $10,000 and lasts for 10,000 shirts, it just transfers $1 of its own value into each shirt. It's constant.
Perfect way to explain it. The second category of investment is the money spent on living labor, the wages.
Okay.
Marx calls this variable capital, which is denoted as V. It is variable because this is the labor capacity we just discussed.
The hand crank generator.
Right. It is the only element capable of expanding and generating new value beyond its original cost.
Okay.
So total capital is C plus V. Now, when the capitalist calculates their financial health at the end of the year, they look at the extra money they made, the surplus value, or S, and they divide it by their total investment.
So they calculate the rate of profit as the surplus divided by the constant capital plus the variable capital.
Yeah.
So mathematically, S divided by C plus V.
Yes, exactly. Let's put concrete numbers to it based on an 1860s industrial scenario, just to make it real for the listener.
Yes, let's do the math.
Let's say a factory owner invests 100 pounds total. 80 pounds is spent on machinery and raw cotton. That's the constant capital C.
Okay. 80 pounds on machines.
And 20 pounds is spent on wages for the workers, the variable capital, V.
So 80 plus 20 is 100. Got it.
Right. At the end of the production cycle, the living labor generates a surplus value of 10 pounds.
Okay, so the true rate of exploitation, what Marx calls the rate of surplus value, is only measured against the variable capital.
Right.
The workers cost 20 pounds, and they generated 10 pounds of extra value. That is a 50% rate of surplus value. I mean, that is a massive extraction of unpaid labor time.
It is massive, but the capitalist doesn't calculate it that way.
Right, they use the whole investment.
Exactly. The capitalist takes that 10 pounds of surplus and divides it by their entire 100-pound investment.
Oh, wow.
Right. 10 pounds divided by 100 pounds is 10%.
So the rate of profit appears on the ledger as a modest, reasonable 10%.
Exactly. This is why Marx writes, profit always expresses surplus value too small.
The mathematical ratio structurally shrinks the appearance of exploitation.
Yeah,
It's like a funhouse mirror.
it really is.
Like imagine you baked a pie that is 30% larger than the pan you used.
Okay.
That extra pie is the surplus. But the accounting department forces you to measure the extra pie against the cost of the entire kitchen, the oven, the building, the mixing bowls.
Right.
Suddenly, that huge surplus looks like a tiny 5% profit on the total kitchen. The math is a funhouse mirror.
That's a great way to put it.
But let me push back on this a little, because a modern investor listening to this might argue, well, why does this distinction actually matter?
Okay, fair question.
Because money is fungible, right? I spent 100 pounds, I got 10 pounds back. Who cares if the surplus came from the machine or the human? The profit rate is the only metric that dictates whether I keep the business open.
And that's exactly how the capitalist thinks. But the distinction matters deeply because it creates a catastrophic blind spot for the capitalist.
A blind spot.
Yes, leading directly to what Marx terms the tendency of the rate of profit to fall.
The tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Okay, break that down.
If the capitalist believes that their total investment, the C plus V, is responsible for generating profit, they will inevitably try to outcompete their rivals by investing more heavily in better machinery.
Right, they increase their constant capital to produce goods faster and cheaper, which makes sense in a competitive market.
Yes. Marx calls this the rising organic composition of capital. But let's return to our math to see what happens.
Let's do it.
Fast forward 20 years. It's now 1880. Our capitalist has vastly expanded their machinery. Now they are investing 400 pounds total.
Okay, big expansion.
Right. 380 pounds is spent on massive, highly efficient steam engines and endless tons of cotton.
So constant capital is way up.
Yes. But because the machines are so incredibly efficient, they still only need to spend 20 pounds on human wages.
Okay, so the variable capital hasn't changed. The human labor is still 20 pounds. And since we established that only human labor creates surplus, the surplus remains 10 pounds.
The math springs the trap.
Wow.
The surplus is 10 pounds. But now the capitalist divides that 10 pounds by their new total investment of 400 pounds.
Oh, geez.
The rate of profit has mathematically plummeted to 2.5%.
2.5%. Down from 10.
Exactly. The capitalist is producing more shirts than ever before, utilizing incredible technology, but their rate of profit is suffocating.
That is just a phenomenal mechanical breakdown. By automating the factory, they have systematically minimized the variable capital, the very human labor capacity that is the sole source of their surplus value.
Yes. The ledger actively incentivizes the capitalist to destroy the engine of their own profitability.
It's wild.
And because they view profit as a return on total capital rather than a return on human exploitation, they are completely baffled when the profit rate drops despite their technological dominance.
They just can't see it.
No. This is the crux of Marx's concept of converted forms in Volume 33. The ledger acts as that funhouse mirror you mentioned. Bourgeois society generates these surface-level metrics, profit, rent, interest, that completely mystify the interconnections of how wealth is actually manufactured.
Right. Profit is a converted form of surplus value.
Yeah.
It wears this mathematical mask.
It does, and the system requires this mystification to function. Because think about it. If the working class clearly saw the 50% rate of surplus value, if the accounting didn't obscure the extraction, the social relations of production would become dangerously transparent.
The workers would realize exactly how much of their day is being taken from them.
Exactly.
So, okay, we have identified the invisible engine labor capacity, and we have seen how the accounting department throws a tarp over it using the converted form of the profit rate.
Right.
But the economy Marx was analyzing wasn't just a collection of isolated textile mills. I mean, once the surplus value is extracted on the factory floor, the commodity has to leave the building. It has to be sold in the world.
Right, it enters circulation.
Exactly. And this forces a fascinating shift in Notebook XV. Marx moves his X-ray machine away from the site of production and points it squarely at the realm of circulation, the merchants, the traders, and the financiers.
He does. He begins a really rigorous analysis of mercantile capital and money-dealing capital. And the terminology used in the sources here is, it's incredibly evocative.
What does he call it?
Marx refers to these financial holdings and merchant stockpiles as circulation reservoirs. He describes amassment in this sector as a mere phenomenon of circulation.
A mere phenomenon of circulation. Let's dissect that phrase. I mean, historically, merchant capital, The traders who moved silk and spices across oceans and money-dealing capital. The early bankers and usurers, they predate industrial capitalism by centuries, right?
Oh, by a long shot, yes.
They were amassing massive fortunes in Venice and Amsterdam long before the steam engine was ever invented.
They absolutely did. But Marx argues that in a fully developed industrial capitalist system, these ancient forms of capital become structurally subordinate.
Subordinate,
Yes, they are secondary derived forms,
meaning they no longer dictate the creation of value.
meaning they do not create value at all.
At all.
Only the production process, only the exploitation of living labor capacity brings new value into existence.
Okay, wait, so what does this all mean for the bankers and the merchants?
Well, the merchant who buys the finished shirts from the factory owner and sells them in a retail shop, they do not add an ounce of new value to the shirt. The banker who lends the factory owner money to buy a new loom, they do not create value.
So what are they doing?
They merely siphon off a portion of the surplus value that was already generated by the factory workers.
This requires a massive shift in how we visualize the economy. Let's update our analogies here to something structural for our listener. Think of it like the architecture of a city's water system.
Oh, okay, I'm with you.
Think of the factory as the water pump. It's pulling new water, new value out of the ground. The financial markets and merchant houses are just the pipes and the holding tanks.
The circulation reservoirs?
Right. They are the reservoirs. They can move the water,
Yeah.
they can amass it, they can hoard it, they can charge a fee to let it pass through their specific junction. But they aren't generating a single new drop of water.
That structural view aligns perfectly with Marx's analysis in Volume 33. The merchants and the financiers, they do perform necessary functions for the industrial capitalist.
Right, the pump needs pipes.
Exactly. The merchant realizes the value of the shirt by finding a buyer quickly, and the banker provides liquidity to keep production continuous. But their profits and their interest rates are merely subdivisions of the original surplus value.
It is the industrial capitalist sharing the spoils.
Yes.
The factory owner generated 10 pounds of surplus value from the workers, and he gives 2 pounds to the merchant for selling the goods and 2 pounds to the banker for the loan. The total pie hasn't grown. It's just being carved up in the circulation phase.
And this is why Marx is so insistent on defining financial amassment as a mere phenomenon. You can witness extraordinary accumulations of wealth in the banking sector, colossal reservoirs of capital, but it is an optical illusion to believe that the financial sector generated that wealth independently.
They're simply collecting the water that was pumped out of the ground by industrial labor.
Exactly.
But consider the vulnerability this introduces to the entire system. What happens when the circulation reservoirs become so hyper-developed, so politically powerful, that they demand a constant, expanding flow of surplus value just to maintain their own bloated infrastructure?
The pressure on the production phase becomes immense. If the banking sector demands higher interest and the merchant sector demands wider margins, the industrial capitalist has only one option to maintain their own profit.
They have to squeeze the workers harder.
Yes. They must increase the rate of surplus value extraction from the workers. They must lengthen the working day or suppress wages or force the workers to produce faster.
The toll booth demand more money, so the factory owner turns up the speed of the assembly line.
Right.
And because these financial reservoirs, the banks, the landlords, the merchants, are so highly visible in everyday life, it makes perfect sense that they became the primary targets for the early critics of capitalism.
Oh, totally.
I mean, the workers interact with the landlord demanding rent and the shopkeeper charging high prices far more aggressively than they understand the abstract mathematics of their own surplus extraction at the factory.
It's visceral.
Yeah.
And this historical reality leads directly into the next major section of Volume 33. We're looking at Notebook XV, focusing on the theories of surplus value.
Right.
And specifically, there's a section titled Proletarian Opposition on the Basis of Ricardo.
Ah, yes.
Marx dedicates hundreds of pages in this manuscript not just to critiquing the mechanics of capitalism, but to ruthlessly critiquing the critics of capitalism.
I have to admit, when navigating these sources, this section felt like a profound detour.
Really? How so?
Well, why does Marx, in the middle of drafting his own revolutionary economic theory, stop to write an exhaustive intellectual history of David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, and a relatively obscure economist named Percy Ravenstone?
Right.
I mean, why spend so much energy tearing down other people's blueprints instead of just finalizing his own theory?
It's a fair question. But it speaks to Marx's fundamental philosophical method, which is rooted in historical materialism. For Marx, you cannot arrive at a complete conception of bourgeois production simply by analyzing factory output.
Okay, so what else do you need?
You must trace how capitalist relations reflect and crystallize in the ideological superstructure.
The superstructure,
Yeah.
meaning the ideas of the time.
Exactly. The minds of the era's leading thinkers. The economic theories of Adam Smith and David Ricardo weren't just academic exercises. They were the ideological software that legitimized and operated the hardware of the 19th century economy.
That makes a lot of sense. You can't just dismantle the machine. You have to dismantle the instruction manual that came with it, that society is using to justify the machine's existence.
That's a great way to put it. And what is fascinating about Notebook XV is Marx's dissection of how early socialist thinkers attempted to use bourgeois economics against the bourgeoisie.
Right, trying to turn their own weapons against them.
Yes, David Ricardo was a classical pro-capitalist economist. But Ricardo championed the labor theory of value, the premise that labor is the ultimate source of value.
Oh.
In the 1820s, a wave of radical thinkers, the Ricardian socialists, seized upon this. And one of the figures Marx heavily analyzes is Percy Ravenstone.
Percy Ravenstone, a radical thinker who saw the immense poverty of the working class and pointed the finger directly at the circulation reservoirs we just discussed.
Yes, Ravenstone and his contemporaries were deeply disturbed by the crushing weight of the national debt, the massive accumulation of capital, and the power of compound interest.
The banks.
Right. They looked at the financiers and landlords hoarding wealth without working, and they diagnosed them as unnatural aberrations.
Okay, so what was their proposed solution?
They argued that if society could just eliminate the bankers, eradicate interest, and strip away the parasitic middlemen, the system would naturally return to a state of fair exchange for the laborer.
It is an incredibly tempting argument, I have to say, and you hear echoes of it in populist movements today. You know, Wall Street is the problem, Main Street is pure.
You hear it constantly.
But based on Marx's math regarding labor capacity that we just went over, Ravenstone's critique is fundamentally flawed.
Completely flawed.
It's like trying to cure a fever by putting an ice pack on the thermometer.
Oh.
They're attacking the symptom, not the disease.
Marx demonstrates that the proletarian opposition based on Ricardo ultimately failed because it lacked the conceptual framework of labor capacity. Ravenstone attacked the financial reservoirs, believing that profit was generated during the circulation of money. He didn't understand that the theft, the generation of surplus value, was already complete before the commodity ever left the factory floor.
If you follow Ravenstone's logic and completely eliminate the banking sector and the landlords, what actually happens? The industrial capitalist simply gets to keep 100% of the surplus value extracted from the workers?
Exactly.
The exploitation of the wage laborer hasn't changed by a single decimal point. The rate of surplus value remains 50%. You haven't stopped the extraction. You've just streamlined who gets to keep the spoils.
By meticulously deconstructing Ravenstone, Malthus, and Ricardo, Marx proves that you cannot reform the capitalist system by merely regulating the sphere of circulation.
You can't just fix the pipes?
No. Compound interest, the falling rate of profit, the immense accumulation of capital, these are not deviations from capitalist laws. They are the unavoidable mathematical outcomes of those laws.
Right.
If the core engine is designed to extract surplus value from human labor capacity, that surplus must eventually pool somewhere. The system will inevitably build massive financial reservoirs to hold it.
Marx forces the critics to look past the Funhouse mirror. He demands that the critique go down to the root, which is the wage-labor relationship itself.
Yes, he does.
And this brings us to an incredible tipping point in the manuscript. We've analyzed the factory, the site of production and value genesis. We have analyzed the banks and markets, the sites of circulation and amassment. We have dissected the ideological software of Ricardo and Ravenstone.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We really have. But this entire engine cannot survive in a closed, static loop.
No. Capitalism is fundamentally incapable of standing still. The mathematical imperative of the system is accumulation. Capital must continuously grow, or it faces crisis and collapse.
This structural demand for perpetual growth forces Marx to expand his diagnostic X-ray geographically.
Yes, it pushes him onto the global stage.
In Notebook NE8, nestled among the theoretical critiques, there is a fascinating draft plan. Marx makes a specific note to examine Wakefield's theory of colonization as an integral part of the section dealing with the reconversion of surplus value into capital.
And this is a crucial concept. The term reconversion of surplus value into capital is the mechanical process of growth.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It means the capitalist takes the surplus value they extracted last year, and rather than just consuming it personally, buying luxury goods, they reinvest it to expand the operation.
To grow the business.
Right. They purchase more constant capital, more raw materials and machinery, and they purchase more variable capital, more human labor capacity.
But a closed system has limits. Eventually, the factory owner exhausts the local supply of raw materials, and more critically, they exhaust the local supply of available workers, which drives wages up and threatens the rate of surplus value.
Yes, the domestic market gets saturated.
Right, so when the internal market is tapped out, capital must violently burst its geographic boundaries.
Which brings Marx to Edward Gibbon Wakefield.
Okay, who was Wakefield?
Wakefield was an English writer, economist, and colonial statesman who developed a highly influential theory of systematic colonization in the 1830s. And this was specifically concerning the settlement of Australia.
Interesting.
Marx found Wakefield's writings extraordinarily revealing, and he would later expand upon this critique to form the culminating chapter of Capital Volume 1.
But why focus on a colonial administrator in Australia when trying to write a universal law of capitalism? What did Wakefield's administrative headaches reveal to Marx about the core mechanics of the system?
Well, Wakefield inadvertently confessed the ultimate secret of capitalist private property.
Oh, really?
Yes. When the British government tried to establish the Swan River colony in Western Australia, they ran into a catastrophic economic problem.
What was the problem?
They provided vast tracts of cheap or even free land to immigrants. But Wakefield realized that if you give immigrants access to free land, they simply become independent, self-sustaining farmers.
Right. Why would a settler agree to walk into a factory and sell their labor capacity to a capitalist for a fraction of its generated value when they could simply own their own farm and keep the entirety of the value they produce?
Exactly. Why would they? Without a desperate population forced to sell their labor, the imported capital, the machinery, and money the wealthy settlers brought with them became utterly useless.
Oh, wow.
Capital cannot function without wage labor. Wakefield complained bitterly that a capitalist could bring 50,000 pounds and the best machinery to Australia, but if he couldn't compel anyone to work for him, he was ruined.
Because machines don't create new value on their own. We established that. Constant capital is useless without variable capital.
Exactly.
So how did Wakefield propose to fix this problem of essentially independent prosperity?
Wakefield's theory of systematic colonization argued that the government must artificially intervene. They needed to set the price of colonial land exorbitantly high.
Artificially high.
Yes, the price had to be set just high enough so that new, poor immigrants could not afford it upon arrival. They would be forced to sell their labor capacity to the colonial capitalists for a period of several years, generating surplus value, until they could eventually save enough to buy land. And the money the government collected from these inflated land sales would then be used to import the next wave of poor laborers to replace them.
That is just a staggering admission. I mean, it proves that the free market of wage labor is not some natural human condition. It has to be violently and artificially engineered.
It does. Capitalist private property relies absolutely on the annihilation of self-earned, independent private property.
It has to destroy independence to create a workforce.
Wakefield confirmed for Marx that the capitalist system requires the systematic expropriation of the laborers. It requires a vast population of people who have been stripped of the means of production, who have nothing left to sell in the market but their own labor capacity.
Right. And when local populations in Europe were fully absorbed, or when independent producers existed on frontiers, capital utilized state power to cross oceans, enclose new lands, dispossess indigenous populations and independent settlers alike, and forcefully manufacture a new class of wage laborers.
Yes. This is where the abstract mathematics of Volume 33 become brutal geopolitical map-making.
This is the ultimate so what moment for our listener. We began this deep dive discussing abstract equations. Constant capital, variable capital, the rate of profit, the funhouse mirror of the ledger.
Right.
But if you follow the math to its logical conclusion, it dictates the expansion of empires.
It's inescapable.
The math demands the reconversion of surplus into capital. The growth demands new value. New value demands the exploitation of new labor capacity. And to secure that capacity, you must reshape the geography of the world, often through the barrel of a gun or the stroke of a colonial administrator's pen.
The formulas written in those notebooks in London trace the precise underlying logic that drove 19th century colonial expansion, the scramble for raw materials, and the establishment of global supply chains that still define our modern era.
The Funhouse mirror of profit doesn't just distort an accountant's ledger, it reshapes the map of the world.
It does. The necessity to constantly accumulate and reinvest surplus value is an inescapable geopolitical imperative.
It is awe-inspiring in a somewhat terrifying way when you connect the micromechanics of the factory floor to the macromechanics of global colonization.
It's all connected.
You realize that Marx was demonstrating that capitalism is an absolute totality. You cannot analyze the local textile mill without analyzing the colonial land policy. You cannot separate the banking reservoirs in London from the expropriation of labor in Australia.
No, you can't.
They're all necessary interlocking components of the exact same underlying dynamic. The extraction, realization, and reconversion of surplus value generated by human labor capacity.
And that is why the meticulous, often agonizingly detailed intellectual labor Marx performed between 1861 and 1863 remains so foundational. He built a diagnostic tool capable of seeing through the converted forms.
Right, he built the X-ray machine.
Exactly. A tool capable of tracing the value from the exhausted worker through the distorting ledger into the financial reservoirs and out into the expanding colonial frontier.
Let's take a collective breath and recap the incredible intellectual architecture we have just navigated in Volume 33. We've covered so much.
We really have.
We began with the paradox of the law of equivalence, the mystery of how fair trades generate massive wealth, and we resolved it by identifying the unique, value-generating properties of labor capacity.
The hand crank generator.
Exactly. We unpacked the math of the factory floor, observing how the rate of profit acts as a mathematical funhouse mirror.
Right, structurally hiding the true rate of exploitation behind the bloated costs of constant capital.
Which inevitably leads to a crisis of falling profit rates. Then we tracked that surplus value as it left the factory, flowing into the massive circulation reservoirs of mercantile and money-dealing capital.
Right, recognizing that these sectors siphon value rather than originate it.
We watched Marx ruthlessly dismantle the ideological software of earlier economists like Ricardo and Ravenstone, proving that attacking the financial reservoirs is a fatal misdiagnosis if you ignore the pump of wage labor itself. And finally, we followed the mathematical imperative of growth to its ultimate global conclusion, the absolute necessity of systematic colonization and the engineered expropriation of laborers to feed the perpetual engine of capital.
It is just a masterpiece of structural analysis. And as we conclude our deep dive today, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative thought. Something to help apply these 19th century notebooks to our immediate present.
I love that. What should they keep in mind?
The next time you see a financial news headline celebrating a massive technology corporation's record-breaking profit margins, or, the launch of a multi-billion-dollar IPO, I want you to remember the X-ray machine of Volume 33. Ask yourself not just how much capital was amassed, but what converted forms are currently being deployed to hide the actual human labor capacity that generated it.
Look past the ledger.
Exactly. Consider whether the highly complex, almost impenetrable terminology of modern finance, the algorithmic high-frequency trading, the collateralized debt obligations, the special purpose acquisition companies.
Right, all that jargon.
Consider if they have simply become the ultimate labyrinthine circulation reservoirs. Has the terminology of modern finance become the ultimate circulation reservoir designed to keep us from seeing the pumps? Are we living in a system of financial pipes so deafeningly loud and so intentionally complex that it is perfectly designed to keep us from ever looking down?
To keep us from seeing the factory floor, the extraction of time, and the people continually turning the crank.
Exactly.
The diagnostic X-ray machine might require patience to operate, and the math might be dense. But once you know what you were looking for, the murky waters of global finance start to become intensely clear. Thank you for taking this profound dive into the source material with us. Remember, true comprehension is about seeing the human engine behind the surface-level numbers. Until next time, keep questioning the ledger.